January 1944. The Western Pacific lies in darkness, a vast expanse of black water broken only by the dim running lights of a lone Japanese destroyer pushing through a restless sea. The air is heavy with salt and humidity, settling on steel surfaces worn thin from months of constant patrol. Most of the crew has been awake far too long, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their thoughts drifting between duty and fatigue. Only the soft churn of the destroyer's engines breaks the silence, until another sound begins to rise from the distant night. It is faint at first, almost indistinguishable from the wind, a low, steady hum carried across miles of open water. But to trained ears it is unmistakable. The deep, rhythmic pulse of American radial aircraft engines, a sound that does not belong to darkness, yet travels through it with confidence born of overwhelming strength. Many aboard had heard it in daylight, those thunderous machines launched from the towering Essex-Class carriers, but hearing them now, in the empty hours before dawn, feels different, more deliberate, more precise. That rising hum signals a shift in the war, one the crew can sense even before the aircraft come into view, and its meaning leads directly into the context behind this moment. By early 1944, the Pacific War had entered a phase defined less by territory and more by momentum. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once dominant across thousands of miles of ocean, now struggled to hold the line against an opponent whose strength grew with every passing month. The United States had unlocked the full capacity of its industrial engine, and nowhere was this more evident than in the expansion of the Essex-Class fleet carriers, ships that symbolized a new era of naval warfare. These carriers were not merely larger platforms, they were floating airfields supported by a logistics network unmatched in scale. Each one carried dozens of aircraft, and each aircraft carried the heartbeat of an industry capable of replacing losses faster than Japan could even count them. The destroyers escorting Japanese convoys knew these ships existed. What they had not fully grasped was how quickly American doctrine was evolving to exploit them. Throughout 1943, the U.S. Navy experimented with tactics once considered too dangerous for carrier warfare. Night recoveries, night patrols, night strikes, concepts dismissed as impractical, began to take shape through rigorous training, new radar systems, and aircraft adapted for low-visibility operations. As these tactics matured, the strategic implications grew clear. If American carriers could operate unhindered in darkness, they could strike anywhere, at any hour, with little warning. For Japanese destroyer crews whose ships were increasingly deployed as pickets or escorts for dwindling supply convoys, the night had always been a fragile protective curtain. Their doctrine relied on using darkness to evade detection or reposition safely. But by 1944, that curtain had begun to tear. Rumors spread across the fleet. American aircraft were appearing in places previously thought unreachable after sunset. Pilots trained specifically for these missions were being rotated into the fast carrier task forces. And as this shift accelerated, the distant hum of radial engines began to take on a new meaning, one that forms the foundation for the deeper context to follow. The turning point came with the formal establishment of specialized night air groups aboard the Essex-Class carriers in mid to late 1944. These units, composed of pilots trained to navigate the Pacific's vast darkness, were equipped with upgraded avionics, radar sets, and modified aircraft such as the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the TBM Avenger. Their training was rigorous, sometimes unforgiving, but it produced crews capable of launching, forming up, and striking targets long after the sun slipped beneath the horizon. To the American Navy, night operations were a solution to a tactical problem. Japanese forces had become adept at dispersing during daylight hours, concealing ships within archipelagos and moving convoys under the protective veil of night. To break this pattern, the U.S. needed to fight in the very environment Japan once claimed as its own. The Essex-Class, with its size, stability, and redundancy, offered the perfect launching platform. Meanwhile, Japanese destroyers were increasingly burdened by missions they had not been designed to sustain. Fuel shortages forced them to operate at reduced speeds. Their radar systems lagged far behind Allied technology, offering little warning of incoming threats. Exhaustion settled into every deck plate. Many ships had endured continuous operations since the Guadalcanal campaign, their crews worn down by relentless strain and a growing awareness that reinforcements would not come. In these conditions, the night, a place once associated with tactical initiative, turned slowly into a realm of uncertainty. Reports from surviving ships spoke of sudden encounters, aircraft appearing out of the blackness, dropping flares over convoy routes, or releasing torpedoes with uncanny precision. The sound of American engines, low and insistent, became an omen repeated in diaries and post-war testimonies. By the time the Japanese destroyer crews gathered on deck on that January night, they understood that these aircraft were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a larger transformation in naval warfare, one that would soon be explored through the angles that defined this shift. The most immediate angle shaping that night in 1944 was the tactical revolution unfolding across the Pacific. For decades, naval doctrine held that large-scale air operations were daytime affairs. Darkness was a barrier, an unpredictable void where navigation faltered, formation discipline broke down, and landing on a moving carrier deck seemed nearly impossible. The U.S. Navy confronted this limitation not by avoiding it, but by mastering it. Through relentless training cycles and technological refinement, American aviators learned to use the night as a strategic weapon. Radar-directed interceptions were at the heart of this shift. American carriers deployed advanced CXAM and later CK series radar systems, enabling controllers to guide pilots over open ocean with surprising precision. These systems were supported by destroyers and cruisers equipped with SG radar, forming a network of overlapping coverage. Japanese ships lacked anything comparable. Their radar systems, when available at all, were limited in range and reliability. Night flying remained dangerous for their pilots, and carrier operations after sunset were virtually non-existent. While Japanese crews relied on eyesight, flare bursts, and sheer instinct, their American counterparts followed electronic guidance through darkness. The contrast was stark. More than equipment, however, the U.S. advantage lay in its ability to train and sustain specialized units. Night Air Group 90 and other emerging night squadrons spent months rehearsing launches, approaches, and carrier landings under conditions that tested both courage and technique. Their success was not accidental. It was engineered. And as night operations matured into a formidable weapon, the industrial story behind this transformation added yet another dimension to the widening imbalance, one shaped by production, logistics, and the relentless engine of democracy. The decisive moment came in the late months of 1944, when the fast carrier task forces surged westward during the Philippines campaign. One night, as scattered clouds drifted silently across the sky, a Japanese destroyer assigned to picket duty maintained a lonely vigil far from the main fleet. The sea was calm, but the atmosphere aboard the ship was tense. Officers knew that American carriers were somewhere beyond the horizon, yet the darkness offered no clues. Their radar screens, limited and unreliable, revealed nothing. The crew relied on sight and instinct, tools that had served them in earlier years but now felt painfully inadequate. Shortly after midnight, the first faint vibration reached the ship. It came not from the water, but from the air, a distant, steady thrum unlike anything produced by the destroyer's own engines. Men on deck paused, listening to the sound rise slowly out of the night. It was unmistakable, the heartbeat of American radial engines, approaching with a confidence that ignored the very concept of darkness. Moments later, radar-equipped Hellcats and Avengers emerged from the gloom, their silhouettes only briefly visible against the clouded sky. They flew in tight formation, their paths guided not by moonlight but by precise electronic direction. To the Japanese crew, the realization was immediate and sobering. The Americans were no longer constrained by night. The one refuge the ocean had offered was gone. And this first encounter, shocking in its clarity, set the stage for the full force of the oncoming strike. The strike unfolded with a precision the Japanese destroyer had never witnessed after sunset. As the American aircraft descended, the night erupted in sudden flashes. Flares dropped from Avengers ignited above the water, casting long, wavering columns of light that revealed the destroyer's position with ruthless clarity. The crew scrambled the stations, but their eyes, long accustomed to the dark, struggled against the blinding glare. Gun crews fired blindly into the sky, their tracers arcing upward without guidance, disappearing long before reaching the distant aircraft. The Americans moved with deliberate calm. Hellcats swept low, strafing the decks with controlled bursts, the rhythmic rattle of their guns merging with the relentless heartbeat of their radial engines. Avengers followed, releasing torpedoes that sliced cleanly into the water, their paths guided by practiced timing rather than sight. Even as chaos erupted aboard the destroyer, fire spreading across the aft deck, shouted orders drowned out by explosions, the attacking aircraft maintained formation, climbing back in the darkness as easily as they had emerged from it. For the men on the Japanese ship, the shock was not only in the destruction itself, but in the realization that the Americans had mastered the night. Their movements suggested an enemy operating with a kind of mechanical certainty, supported by technology and training Japan could no longer hope to match. As the sound of the departing engines faded into the vast Pacific, the implication remained unmistakable. The war at sea had shifted irrevocably, and the aftermath of this single night would make the consequences impossible to ignore. When dawn finally rose over the Pacific, the extent of the damage became clear. The destroyer, scorched along its decks and listing slightly from the torpedo's impact, had survived the night only through desperate effort and the luck of a glancing hit. But survival did not erase the deeper truth revealed by the attack. Officers moved quietly among the wreckage, taking account of broken gun mounts, shattered railings, and the exhausted faces of men who had fought in near blindness. Their reports, later consolidated into fleet summaries, spoke not only of physical losses, but of a profound psychological shift. Post-war analyses confirm what those survivors sensed in the moment. The Japanese surface fleet was no longer capable of controlling its environment. Night, once a tactical refuge and central pillar of Japanese doctrine, now belonged to the Americans. The sound of radial engines, steady, assured, and unchallenged, had marked the transition with unmistakable clarity. And as those reports traveled up the chain of command, the strategic consequences for Japan became painfully evident, setting the stage for the broader aftermath to follow. Across the broader Pacific, the implications of that night extended far beyond the damage inflicted on a single destroyer. American reconnaissance confirmed a growing pattern. Japanese destroyers, once the fleet's agile hunters, were increasingly found operating defensively, scattered across long convoy routes and vulnerable picket lines. Their commanders knew they were being stretched thin, yet the demands of a collapsing logistical network left them no alternative. Every ship had to do the work of several, and every night opened the possibility of another sudden strike from an unseen enemy. Meanwhile, the Essex-Class carriers only grew stronger. Through 1944 and into 1945, new hulls joined the fleet at a pace unmatched by any navy in history. Each arrival brought more aircraft, more trained pilots, and more confidence. The night air groups refined their methods with every operation, turning what had begun as an ambitious experiment into a reliable instrument of strategy. By early 1945, American carriers could launch coordinated day and night cycles that overwhelmed Japanese defenses, leaving no hour of safety anywhere across the central or western Pacific. For Japanese destroyer crews, the psychological weight was immense. Reports from fleet headquarters noted a marked decline in morale, with seasoned sailors privately acknowledging that they were fighting an opponent whose capabilities had surpassed anything Japan could field. Many understood that even if the ship survived the next attack, the war was slipping beyond recovery. The contrast between their own strained resources and the seemingly endless output of American industry became a quiet refrain across the fleet. And always, the memory returned to the same moment. The low, unwavering hum of radial engines rising through the night. It was a sound that no longer signified just an approaching raid, but the presence of an enemy whose momentum could not be reversed. He stands there, breathing hard, the echo of his own footsteps still hanging in the air, and for the first time, he's not afraid of the silence that follows. Because in that silence, he hears something he's ignored for years. The truth. Not the loud truth people shout at him, not the heavy truth he carries from his past, but the quiet truth that has always lived inside him, waiting for this exact moment. He realizes that every time he doubted himself, every time he held back, every time he walked away from something he deeply wanted, it wasn't because he wasn't capable. It wasn't because he wasn't chosen. It wasn't because life was unfair. It was because he didn't believe he was allowed to choose himself. He looks at his hands. He looks at the path behind him. And suddenly, something becomes painfully, beautifully clear. All this time, he wasn't fighting the world. He was fighting the version of himself that refused to grow. The version that wanted comfort instead of courage, familiarity instead of risk, excuses instead of effort. Now he sees the truth with a clarity that almost hurts. Nothing changes unless he does. He realizes that persistence isn't about pushing harder. It's about refusing to return to the person he used to be. It's about choosing the uncomfortable path not because it's easy, but because it's the only path that leads forward. He understands now that growth isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It's not always inspiring. Sometimes growth is simply the quiet decision to keep going. And as he steps forward, he doesn't wonder whether he's ready. For the first time, he knows he is becoming someone who arrives.